Good morning, everybody. Welcome to IGTV. It is 9:20, and on with the InfraGard Insight for the week is Mark Cappers. And Mark, I love your mug, and I'll do you one. There you go. I'm cheering you myself. Okay, so you're going to set us up today with security policy standards, technical requirements, and the impact of changing business, technology, and legal obligations. Take off, Mark. Go ahead.
Good morning, Joe. Thank you. Today I talk about policies, standards, technical requirements, and why these things don't exist as sort of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You need to make sure that you have a robust policy framework and you revisit these things from time to time to make sure that you're not setting up barriers to your business or your security. So quickly getting into it, the basis of any policy is, you want to protect your people and your information. And this is a declaration of what your intentions are and what your commitments are to protect that people and information. You're setting the rules for expected behavior, not only by the users, but by the systems administrators. What are the roles and responsibilities and behavior expected by management and security personnel. You want to be able to tell people that you're going to authorize your security personnel to monitor, probe, and investigate. Sometimes you have to actually legally disclose that. As many of us log into different systems, there's always a disclaimer that pops up that we agree that we will be monitored. We do not have an expectation of privacy. And later on down the line, if you have a security incident or law enforcement gets involved, sometimes those things are critical to protect you from eavesdropping laws, wiretapping laws, etc. Being used against you in your own house, so to speak. Good policies also define and authorize consequences of violation to them, and you help the organization define a baseline on security. Doing all that helps you minimize your risks, and in addition, if you can put your regulatory posture and how you're going to respond to the laws and regulations that exist for your organization, it'll help you track compliance. So again, talking about, getting that policy in place, you want to provide a framework that can be followed by everyone in the organization. And the idea is to ensure the risk is minimized and you can effectively respond to security incidents. The other thing that policies are helpful with is catalysts for change. If you're trying to take you from a current state to a better security posture or a more mature security posture, revisiting your policy and then distributing that to the user community and the organization enterprise as a whole can help you catalyze some of that change. So you can use it with your security awareness and other education efforts. Writing policy, always it's a good idea to use a SMART principle, specific, measurable, agreeable, realistic, and time-bound. Make sure you have good roles and responsibilities defined. For each policy, individual policies, you want to have limited scope and have it well defined. Again, document the sanctions of violations. Within the policy itself, you want to make sure you understand the life cycle of that policy, so revisions and updating schedules are there in the policy along with it. Other useful things to have: contact information, definitions, glossary, acronyms, and kind of moving a little bit deeper down to the next layer with the policy hierarchy. Typically, SANS, NIST, and other places, there are two, but sometimes more layers of policy, requirements, standards, guidelines, and other things. But basically, most of the security frameworks out there will operate at two levels. You have a policy level and what I'll call a standards level. And sometimes you'll see a generic standard, and then below that there'll be technical procedure and technical requirements, but a lot of times that'll just be kind of muddled. And if you're a small and medium organization, you may not need to go too crazy with the hierarchy or the matrix. So at the policy level, typically you'll have a policy statement. Sometimes you'll have a policy ID number. You want a statement of purpose. You want a responsibility area, support information, expiration date. Again, at the standards level, similar type of thing. You have a standard statement. Sometimes you'll have a standards ID. You'll have the associated policy that that standard supports. Sometimes it's one policy, sometimes it's many policy. Typically, you'll see policy at the high level. You'll see policies tracked to the 10 names of domains of CISSP or 7799. And then when you get down to the standards, you can have standards that will support many things. A password length standard might support your access policy, but it might also support your authentication policy, as well as a couple of others. So, talking about that hierarchy, so your policies are high-level commitments, and the standards that are below them support those policies. The standards specify the technical and sometimes non-technical actions that must be taken to achieve the policies. You have a standard that'll get down to a specific security requirement, and you want to make sure you address that. So security standards don't always apply across the board. Sometimes they can be very narrowly defined, and in some cases, when people are executing something, you'll look at a list of standards, and 3 of them will apply to an authentication scheme, and the other 30 won't. So it's an objective measurement rather than subjective. You're actually trying to tackle a specific thing. Sometimes they can be technology independent. I like to have standards at a higher level than technical requirements, but if you're a smaller organization, I would bring them all at the same level. But you want to specify the quantity, how much, how many, what size, what's number, what's the strength if you're talking about crypto, what's the quality, how well in accordance to the particular policy or the document that applies to that technology or specific guideline. It can imply locality, where you expect to do that. A lot of times you'll see policies and standards written to apply for trusted networks versus non-trusted networks. And again, this gets back into controlling your remote users. So while you are within the walls of your physical facilities, one set of standards may apply. When you're out doing Wi-Fi at a Starbucks someplace, obviously a different set of standards may apply, but their end objectives ought to bring you to the same place. Sometimes you'll specify personnel. If you have certain policies regarding privileged access, application entities, database and system entities, sometimes specific machines, machine types, third-party clients, etc., as well as temporality, which is, at what time, how often, and what duration. And if there are other specific conditions, those will apply too. And again, getting into the technical requirements that you may have with certain types of technologies, you might actually have a specification of how you configure something with that technology or specify a standard operating procedure. And if you're in some of the highly regulated areas like food and drug, SOPs are very, very important. So moving quickly into the meat of what I want to get to is policy roadmap and life cycle. Typically, we have to do policies because we're audited against, 7799, 2701, and that requires that you have certain policies documented. But a lot of times, that's sort of a set it and forget it thing. It gets written once, and then every 5 years, you grudgingly get dragged back through it. A better security posture would be to actively embrace the life cycle of policies. So policies need to evolve with the organization over time. Your business models change over time. Your core business may not, but how you achieve that business changes over time. The technologies you use change over time. So stagnant policies create barriers to both your business objectives and your technical implementation. If you're using policies that were written for, Novell 386 and begrudgingly worked with NT, you need to revisit that because we're living in a much different world now. And the enabling technologies of modern technology change how you can address that security, both in terms of increasing your security capability, because if your policies were written to something that wasn't really securable, now you have something that might be more securable, and you can change that policy to reflect that. So you also want a policy lifecycle that adapts to the new business and technology. but also reevaluate your legacy policies against the current business objectives and technology used. It's an enterprise process, and again, this ties back into having good IT security governance. The better your IT security governance works, the better you'll do with your policies. Your policies got to be workable. If you have policies that nobody can obey or are too obscure or baroque to follow, they're not going to be followed. They're going to be ignored. If they create a barrier to departments getting things done, they're going to be ignored. People will work around anything to get their job done. So make sure that you create policies that allow people to do their job. Anything help you enhance your business processes by having good security policies. So they ought to be concise and easy to understand. Again, that fine balance, and you have to work with your stakeholders, your IT security personnel, and your leadership to determine what the right balance is between protection and productivity, should that be at odds. You need to state the reasons why the policy is needed, describe what's covered by the policies, and always have good contacts and responsibilities documented. And you also ought to discuss how violations will be handled, because you don't want to get into a situation, again, protecting your own liability. If you have a behavior policy that talks about internet usage or email usage, have that documented so that if you have a situation that you have to reprimand somebody or terminate somebody, that has been documented well in advance of the event so that nobody can turn around and say, well, I didn't know that was going to happen, or you have a wrongful termination suit, or you find yourself in another actionable position. So to start out on the road, if you have a very old policy and you need to revisit it, or say you just have, sometimes you'll buy one off the shelf and put it in and kind of ignore it until you have to, what's the best way to go forward? And first question you've got to ask yourself is what is the framework that you need to use for your policies? There are several industry standards out there. COBIT, BS 7799/ISO 27001, SEE-CMM. Some people have modeled their policy after the CISSP. Again, it's 10 domains, so it covers a lot of areas. So once you decide on, if you have an audit framework that you need to use, once you decide on that, that'll kind of set that in a manner that you can model your policies to map to that. Then the heavy lifting begins, and this is where we'll see a recurring theme, and that is you go out to your business groups, your major business stakeholders, and I would include HR, I'd include legal, finance. Make sure you have some element of representation from every critical part of your business or organization, and you need to document their business requirements. You need to go back in and identify and value their data assets, not only in terms of potential loss, but in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Again, understanding those data assets is critical to be doing anything in information security. So that's why we see that over and over again. If you don't know how to protect your data and you don't know the value of the data, then you're probably doing the wrong thing. So then you need to go back and survey the technology and architecture, because that's going to drive how you configure that architecture, how you configure the technology. And I'd also, at this point, with policies, while regulatory compliance is not necessarily part of policy, it's a good idea to take this opportunity to understand what regulations apply to your organization. You've got all the stakeholders talking about what their business is and how they do their business. Talk about what regulations apply to them. How do they think they should respond? Make sure you get your legal involved and craft an appropriate policy response. After you've got all that bucket of information, unfortunately, you then have to go back and do some analysis, and that's identify the vulnerabilities and threats to your organization and the technology that you're using, and do an evaluation of your measures and controls. And that's a very, very, that's a classic risk management problem, and it's worth spending some time thinking about, what if scenarios, how much value is in that data, and how do you protect it, and what's an effective, cost-effective control. And then you take all that and you map it against your current policy and standards. And then going forward, plan to do it again in the next year or quarter or whatever your appropriate response is as you need to develop this stuff. And that's policies and standards quickly in a nutshell.
Well, That's not bad, Mark. That's not bad at all. All right. Thank you very much. I certainly do appreciate that. And let me just flip the screens over here. Okay, so that was Mark Capus. All right. And as we tell everybody, Mark, this is sort of like a briefing, dip your toes in the water type of deal. All right. We're certainly not in 10 to 15 minutes are we going to cover any of this from soup to nuts.